"You're coming with me," said the rancher to the woman rejected for 3 girls. Wild West stories. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. On a winter ridge where silence ruled stronger than law, a rancher lived alone with nothing but fire for company. Down in the valley, a woman carried 3 daughters no one wanted. When their paths crossed, the West itself seemed to pause, to ask if kindness could still build a home where storms had torn lives apart. In a land built on silence, one man left an extra chair at his table without knowing why. The wind of late winter dragged across the ridge like a tired beast, its breath rattling through gray grass and loose boards in the fence line. Clouds moved slow as cold ash above the valley, and a single cabin leaned against the slope as if it too needed something solid to rest on. Out here, a man could live a whole life and still feel smaller than the dust carried by the wind. The rancher woke before first light. He always did. His hands worked by habit, stirring coals, laying kindling, setting the iron pot near the firebox. The chores never rushed, never slowed, only steady as his own pulse. The horses shifted in the dark, hooves muffled by straw. Smoke clung to his coat the way silence clung to the cabin walls. He ate from a tin bowl, alone. He mended what broke, alone. He returned each night to a table that never held more than 1 plate. By the east fence he stopped, testing a sagging post. The iron staple had rusted thin. He braced it with his knee, pulled the wire tight, tied the knot neat and sharp. He slapped the post once, a quiet pat, like you might give a man you don't speak much to, but trust just the same. Beyond, a ribbon of ice clung to the creek, water whispering beneath. He found a smooth scrap of cedar there, slipped it into his pocket. He didn't know why, just kept it. Out here, small things were worth holding on to. When the sun finally broke over the ridge, the roof nails caught the light like bits of gold dust. He set his chair on the porch and sat, staring down the narrow dirt road. Every morning he looked that way, as if the ruts and wheel marks might answer him. They never did. He told no one of the thought that tugged at him, but it was there. Maybe one day that road would bring more than silence. He'd even left an extra bowl on the shelf, not for company, but for a chance. Men his age didn't dream out loud. They dreamed by cutting more wood than they needed, fixing hinges smooth, keeping a door ready to open without creak. Later, he saddled his horse, followed the trail through snow-scabbed brush. His eyes read signs others missed: broken grass, a feather snagged in briar, fox tracks curving off into rock. He brought home a bundle of dry limbs, a jar of tallow, and that cedar scrap. Enough to keep a cabin warm, enough to quiet the wind inside. Down in the low valley, another figure moved. A woman, worn thin by miles, carried 3 infants wrapped in a single blanket. Her shoulders bent, but never gave. Each step cracked old snow, each pause only long enough to shift the smallest child against her chest. She had nothing more than a wooden spoon, a crust of bread, and scraps of cloth she tore into makeshift booties. Out here, such small things kept breath inside a body longer than a pistol ever could. She did not speak. She only walked. Her longing was simple: a roof that did not leak, a fire that did not die before dawn. That night, the man placed the cedar scrap on his windowsill, smoothed but unmarked. He studied it a moment, then let the fire burn low. Outside, branches clawed the roof, the sound of a lonely hand against wood. He doused the lamp early, let the dark sit close. Miles below, the woman leaned against a pine, children pressed warm as coals against her breast. She closed her eyes, but did not sleep. Stars spilled across the sky like salt, cold but constant. In her silence, her wish rose like steam off milk, plain, warm, nameless, only to wake and find ground firm enough to stand on. 2 lights glowed far apart, one from a small window in the cabin above, one from the ember of a hidden fire at the tree's base. Neither knew the other, yet both kept the dark from winning. Out here, warmth was not a measure of degrees. Warmth was a man setting an extra bowl on the shelf, just in case. Warmth was a woman holding 3 small lives against her heart, refusing to let go. The night closed around them like the cover of a well-worn book, spine cracked, pages thin, but holding still. Somewhere in that wind, what had no name began to gather, like green shoots waiting beneath frozen ground. The cabin was no more than wood and stone, but every empty chair carried its own weight. Morning broke with a pale sun, thin light spilling through a sky the color of old tin. The rancher stepped outside, boots sinking into half-frozen earth, and the smell of wood smoke lingered close to the eaves. He carried water from the creek, shoulders squared against the cold, poured it into the trough till the ice cracked and groaned. The horses lowered their heads to drink, breath rising in white clouds that drifted like ghosts between the rails. Inside, the cabin was as bare as a man's life could be. 4 walls, a hearth, a rough-hewn table scarred by years of knives and cups, one bed pushed against the far corner, a chair that rocked when the floor creaked, and another that did not. Everything had its place, and every place carried silence. The only sound was the fire licking along a split log, breaking into sudden sparks that climbed and vanished in the rafters. He fixed his meal the same way he had the morning before, and the one before that. Beans softened overnight, a heel of bread browned by the fire, coffee bitter enough to bite the tongue. He ate slow, chewing as much out of thought as out of hunger. When finished, he set the plate back down, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and looked at the chair across from him. Empty, as always. He let his eyes rest there longer than he meant to, then turned away, busying himself with the tools laid neatly along the wall. By midday, the sun had climbed high enough to melt the thin frost at the edge of the roof, drops pattering into the dirt below. The rancher worked his fence line again, tamping soil, driving posts deeper into ground that had held against storms, but now leaned tired from years of weight. The hammer rang dull against the staples, each strike measured, steady, the kind of rhythm a man keeps when he doesn't want to think too much. Across the valley, the woman pressed forward. Her steps were slow, but she never stopped for long. She cradled the smallest child beneath her coat, adjusting the others close at her sides. Her hair stuck in damp strands to her temples, her lips cracked with cold. She spoke to no one, not even to the girls. Words were wasted when breath was needed to climb. Instead, she hummed, low and broken, the fragments of a tune her mother had once sung. The sound was so faint it dissolved in the wind, but it soothed her more than it reached the children. When she found a fallen tree at the bend of the trail, she rested there. She rubbed the tiny feet of her daughters, blowing warm air into her hands, before wrapping the scraps of cloth tighter. She pulled a strip of jerky from her satchel, chewed it till it softened, then pressed a bit into each child's mouth. The smallest swallowed with effort, but swallowed. That was enough. She leaned her back to the bark, let her head fall back, and closed her eyes. Just for a breath, just long enough to feel the ache ease from her spine. Then she rose again, because there was no choice but forward. Afternoon shadows stretched across the land like long fingers. The cabin sat quiet under the ridge, smoke rising in a thin, straight line. The man split wood outside, muscles rolling under his worn shirt, his face unreadable as stone. He paused once, laying an arm across his brow, and in that moment the valley seemed wider than it had ever been. He turned his head toward the trail without meaning to, squinting into the distance where nothing yet stirred. Far below, the woman's figure was small against the slope, no more than a dark stitch in the white cloth of snow. She didn't know the cabin waited above, and he didn't know she was climbing toward it, but both kept moving in their separate ways, bound by needs neither had spoken. Evening returned, and with it the old patterns. The rancher lighting the lamp, setting another log to burn, hanging his coat by the door. His cabin groaned under the wind, but held firm. He sat at the table, sharpening a knife against stone, the sound soft but certain. On the other side of the ridge, the woman pulled her shawl tight, pressed her cheek against her daughters' heads, and rocked them to sleep with nothing but the beat of her own tired heart. 2 lives, running on separate rails, each caught in the everyday grind of survival. Yet both were leaning, without knowing, toward a meeting that would bend the course of their days. He had chosen solitude. She had been forced into it. Neither yet knew they walked the same trail. The next day bled gray across the mountains, the kind of light that never quite reaches the ground. The rancher woke to the sound of the roof beams creaking in the cold, and for a moment he lay still, listening. The cabin always talked to him in its own way. Wood settling, fire breathing, the long sigh of wind through the cracks. He had grown used to those voices, so much so that the absence of any other had become a habit he carried like a coat. He went about the morning as always, splitting wood, carrying water, brushing down the horses, each task finished neat, with no one to see but himself. He did not mind the quiet, or told himself so often enough that it felt true. Still, when he returned inside and saw the empty chair by the table, the thought crossed his mind again, quick and sharp. A life can be too quiet. He did not linger on it, only sat with his meal, spoon clicking against the tin bowl, echoing larger than it should have in a room built for more than one. By the time the sun sat low, the woman had drawn nearer to the ridge. She moved in silence, her shawl stiff with frost, her arms aching from the weight of 3 small bodies pressed against her. When she stumbled, she did not curse, only steadied herself and walked on. Her breath came harsh, but she held it back, unwilling to let the children feel her weakness. She stopped once to shift the smallest into the crook of her arm. The baby stirred, whimpered, then settled. She whispered nothing in return. Words had lost their place on her tongue, buried under all the dismissals and scorn she had carried since the girls were born. To speak now felt useless, so she walked. That evening, as the rancher stirred beans over the fire, he thought again of the road below. It was habit by now, a glance more than a thought, but this time he lingered longer at the window. His hand rested on the cedar scraps he had left on the sill, smoothed flat, but still waiting for meaning. He picked one up, turned it in his palm, then set it back. He had no cause to mark them yet, not yet. On the trail below, the woman paused under a pine. The night was closing around her, stars brittle, the air thin as glass. She laid her daughters down on the shawl, rubbed their hands and feet, tucking cloth tighter, making do with nothing. Her body begged for rest, but her mind whispered the same old refrain. 3 girls, 3 burdens. She carried that brand like a scar across her heart. No one wanted them. Not the man who fathered them, not the family who had once claimed her. The world had spoken that verdict in its silence, and now she spoke it to herself by saying nothing at all. Between them stretched miles of dark and snow, but the same barrier held, one man who had learned to live alone, one woman who believed she was unworthy to stay. Neither spoke their longing, neither would admit to it, even if asked. Their silence stood taller than the mountains themselves, and it would take more than words to bring it down. Inside the cabin, the rancher added another log, sparks leaping in the chimney's throat. He sat back in his chair, hands folded, listening to the crackle. He didn't know why, but he left the lamp burning longer than usual, as though holding it up against the dark might answer something he couldn't name. And far below, the woman bent low over her daughters, shielding them with her body. She closed her eyes against the night, and the thought came unbidden. If someone opened a door just once, I'd walk through it. But the thought stayed silent, as all her thoughts did. 2 lives, each bound by silence, his chosen, hers forced, moving closer step by step, though neither yet knew it. Her scars spoke louder than words, and his silence hid wounds of its own. The ridge woke slow that morning, as if the sun itself hesitated before rising. A thin veil of mist drifted across the timber, wrapping the valley in a hushed kind of gray. The rancher saddled his horse, the leather stiff with frost, and set out to check traps along the creek. His breath smoked, rising in brief clouds, then vanished into the cold. He rode without hurry, eyes always scanning, reading the ground, reading the sky, the way men do who've spent too long with silence as their only company. By midday, he was back at the cabin, leading his horse through the gate. He paused on the porch, hand resting on the rail, listening. It was a habit of his, listening before entering, as though the cabin might one day answer with more than the crack of settling logs. But it never did. He stepped inside, laid down the pelts he'd gathered, and lit the fire again. The cedar scraps still sat on the sill, waiting. He ran a thumb along the smooth grain and wondered why he kept them. He had no name to carve into the wood. Not yet. On the lower slope, the woman walked with her head bent against the wind. Her shawl was stiff from the night's frost, and the baby stirred weakly within. She stopped beside a fallen stump, lowering herself with care. For a moment she pressed her wrist to her lips, the skin raw, ringed with scars that told a story without words. Old wounds still healing. She did not touch them long. She pulled the cloth tighter around her daughters, rubbed warmth into their hands, and rose again. There was no room for her own pain, not when 3 small lives leaned on her for every step. As she climbed higher, the past dragged along behind her, like a shadow that never thinned. A husband who had turned from her, a family who had said little but looked much. Each silence had cut deeper than any word. Each bruise left more than color. It left the echo of being unwanted. She had learned not to speak of it, because words had never changed a man's mind, nor softened a hand raised in anger. Better to keep quiet, better to endure. So she did. That evening, as the rancher mended a harness by lamplight, he found himself staring at the empty bed against the wall. The quilts lay flat, undisturbed. He thought of the old days when his mother had sewn those quilts, stitching small patterns into cloth that had outlasted her. He ran his hand across the worn fabric, and a thought brushed against him, unspoken. These blankets were made to hold more than cold air. He shook his head, set the harness aside, and returned to the fire. Far below, the woman bent low over her children, feeding them tiny bits of softened bread. Their mouths moved slow, eyes half-lidded, but they ate. She whispered nothing, yet every gesture was a vow that they would live, no matter the cost. Her back ached, her arms trembled, but she did not falter. The bruises along her shins, the old scar beneath her jaw, she carried them quietly, like extra weight in her pack. She had learned that the world turned harder when it saw a woman stumble, so she did not stumble where anyone could see. Night came. The rancher set one more log on the fire, the glow painting the cabin walls in soft gold. He sat by the hearth, knife in hand, shaving curls from a piece of wood. He didn't know what he was shaping, only that his hands needed something to do, something to keep the silence from crowding him. The curls of cedar fell to the floor, catching the firelight, small and bright against the dark. Somewhere below, beneath another sky of stars, the woman cradled her daughters close, her own body the only wall between them and the night. She traced a finger over the scar at her wrist, then pressed her lips against each child's forehead. She said nothing. She didn't need to. The old wounds spoke enough. The mountains held them both, each alone, each carrying pain too heavy for words. Neither knew how near the other was, nor how the road ahead would draw those wounds into the same firelight. Sometimes it takes a stranger's plain truth to show two lonely souls their worth. The mountain settled into a softer light as spring edged its way into the valley. Snow still clung to the shadows, but the ridges showed streaks of brown earth, wet and raw. The rancher moved through his chores without hurry, mending a broken latch, stacking the last of the winter wood, checking the roof where the snow melt had dripped too long. His hands were steady, but his eyes carried the same tired distance. He had grown used to the rhythm of work filling the space where voices should have been. That afternoon, a rider appeared on the trail. An older woman, bent in the saddle, her shawl green with years of wear. The rancher recognized her before she dismounted, a neighbor of sorts, though her cabin lay miles away across the ridge. She lived alone too, a widow who raised a few goats and traded herbs in town when she had the strength. Folks called her Hattie, though she answered to little more than a nod. She tied her mare to the fence and stepped to the porch without waiting for invitation. The rancher set down his axe and met her with a quiet tilt of his head. She carried a sack of potatoes, small and misshapen, and 2 jars of dried beans. She handed them over like it was nothing, like kindness was just another chore. Inside, she sat near the fire, her hands loose on her knees, her gaze sweeping the cabin's emptiness. She did not remark on it, but the rancher saw her eyes rest a moment too long on the second chair by the table. She broke the silence first, not with a question, not with advice, only a plain line spoken in the slow drawl of a woman who had lived long enough to know the weight of quiet. "Folks don't need to be perfect," she said, watching the fire. "Just decent enough to stay." The rancher didn't answer. He only shifted the potatoes onto the shelf, set the beans beside them, and poked at the fire with the iron rod. Sparks rose, small and stubborn. When Hattie left, she didn't look back. She mounted slow, pulled her shawl close, and rode toward the timberline, her shape thinning into the dusk until only the sound of hooves lingered. The rancher stood on the porch long after she was gone, the words she left behind heavier than the sack she'd carried. Decent enough to stay. The phrase hung in the air, and he found himself turning it over the way a man turns a stone in his hand, feeling the edges without knowing what to do with it. Far down the slope, the woman moved with her daughters pressed close. She found shelter for the night near a creek bed, lining a shallow hollow with pine boughs. She worked quietly, tucking each child into the crude nest, smoothing their hair with the gentlest of touches. When she finally rested, she looked up through the bare branches. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no sound came. Instead, she heard in her memory the echo of voices long gone, voices that had once told her she was less, that 3 daughters were nothing but mouths to feed. She closed her eyes against it. But then, faint and unbidden, another memory surfaced, her own mother's hand on her shoulder, years ago, whispering that kindness mattered more than bloodlines or sons. The words had been nearly lost beneath all the years of silence and shame. Yet tonight they returned, fragile but present, decent enough to stay. She did not know the widow had spoken those same words to a man above the ridge. She only knew that in her heart, the old wound throbbed less when she remembered them. The valley carried 2 echoes that night, one spoken aloud beside a fire, one remembered in the dark beneath a tree. Neither knew the other was holding the same thought, but both felt it settle, quiet and steady, like a hand resting gently on the back. And in that shared stillness, the barrier between them thinned, though they had not yet met. A man carved names into cedar. A mother pressed hope into her daughter's skin, both keys to the same lock. The days slipped one into another, snow retreating inch by inch from the ridges, leaving behind wet earth that smelled of pine and stone. The rancher moved through his chores with the same quiet patience. Yet something inside him had shifted. Hattie's words had not left. They sat in him like an ember that refused to die, glowing each time he caught sight of the second chair by the table, each time he touched the cedar scraps, still waiting on the windowsill. One evening, after he had hauled water and stacked wood, he sat by the hearth with a knife in hand. The cabin was hushed, but for the steady crack of fire. He lifted one of the cedar pieces, its surface smooth beneath his thumb, and began to carve. The knife moved slow, deliberate shaving curls that dropped to the floor like coiled ribbons. He carved letters, not full names, not yet, but the first strokes, plain and strong. He didn't know whose names they would be. He only knew he wanted them marked, made real, given place on these walls where silence had reigned too long. By lamplight, 3 small plaques took shape. He set them in a row on the shelf above the hearth. The firelight caught the fresh cuts, bright as silver. For the first time in years, the cabin looked less like a shelter and more like a home preparing for someone's return. Down the slope, the woman rested beneath the shelter of a leaning pine. Her daughters lay nestled against her, cheeks warmed by her body heat, breaths soft in the night air. She stroked the hair from their foreheads with fingers worn raw, each touch a vow spoken without sound. When one whimpered, she pressed her lips to the crown of the tiny head, humming a tune too faint to carry, but steady enough to soothe. Her thoughts wandered, unbidden. She remembered the cold post where she had once been bound, the barbs that tore skin, the shame of being left because she had given life to daughters. Those wounds still ached, though she did not show it. But as she touched her girls, she felt something stir, a defiance, soft but certain. If the world had no place for them, then she would make one, even if it was nothing more than a patch of ground beneath a pine. She would make it theirs. In that moment, without knowing, she mirrored the man on the ridge. He carved names into cedar. She pressed tenderness into skin, Both were acts of kindness, small and ordinary, yet each was a key turning in a lock they had carried too long. The night deepened. The rancher placed his knife aside, the plaques lined neatly on the shelf. He leaned back in his chair, eyes fixed on the fire. A quiet settled in him, not the lonely kind he had known for years, but a quieter born of waiting. For what? He could not yet say. And down in the valley, the woman closed her eyes, with her daughters safe against her. For the first time in many nights, her last thought before sleep was not fear of the cold, but a whisper of hope, that somewhere, somehow, there might be a door that opened and a fire that waited. Between them, kindness had been planted. They did not see each other, did not hear, but the mountain carried it like a secret promise. He stood with empty hands on the ridge and told 4 armed men, "She was never yours." The ridge carried a hush that day, the kind that made even the birds still their wings. Clouds pressed low, swollen with weather, and the light dimmed early, as though the sun had tired of shining. The rancher stood on his porch, hat brim low, watching the trail wind down into the valley. His breath plumed in the chill air. He didn't know what he expected, but he stayed there, listening. By late afternoon, the sound came, distant hooves cutting against the silence. 4 riders eased up the slope, their coats dark against the snow-patched earth. The rancher did not move. He stepped down from the porch, boots crunching slow, and stood in the yard with arms loose at his sides. The men halted a few yards away, horses stamping restless. The lead rider tipped his hat, voice rough with authority. "We come to claim what's ours," he said. The rancher's eyes narrowed, steady. He didn't reach for the rifle inside the cabin. He didn't step back. He let the silence stretch long enough for the words to lose their weight. Then, in a voice low and certain, he answered, "She was never yours, and she sure as hell ain't now." The wind shifted, carrying his words into the trees. The riders exchanged glances, unsettled not by threat, but by the stillness of a man who would not yield. One reached for his reins as though testing the ground, but the leader pulled back. Something in the rancher's stance, the way he planted himself, as if rooted into the earth, told them no fight here would be won. For a moment, all that moved was the steam rising from the horse's nostrils, curling white in the fading light. Then, without another word, the riders turned. Hooves struck sharp against frozen dirt, fading into the valley. The rancher stood there long after they were gone, his breath slow, jaw set. He knew they would be back. Trouble didn't end with a single turn of reins. Still, for now, the mountain held quiet again. He turned, stepped inside, and shut the door against the cold. Down in the valley, the woman gathered her daughters close in a shallow hollow of pine branches. She felt the shift in the air, though she had not seen what had passed. Her arms tightened around the girls, rocking them as the first flakes of snow began to fall again. In her silence, she whispered a vow only her heart could hear. "They will not take us, not again." That night, the rancher lit his lamp and stared at the cedar plaques on the shelf. He ran his finger over the unfinished letters, each groove rough but true. He thought of the riders, of the claim they had spoken, and of the quiet defiance in his answer. For the first time, his solitude did not feel like strength. It felt like a wall too small to hold what had begun to grow. The fire burned low, sparks drifting upward. Outside, snow thickened, covering tracks, hiding the scars of the day. The cabin breathed, with its own kind of silence, but it was no longer the silence of emptiness. It was the silence of waiting, waiting for the moment when kindness and defiance would have to stand together against the storm. Home was not built in a day, but in the quiet rhythm of soup simmering and wood stacked high. Spring came slow to the mountains, as though the land itself doubted it could soften after so long under ice. Snow thinned on the ridges, water trickled in hidden gullies, and the first shoots of green pressed through black soil. The air smelled different, earthy, damp, alive. In that change, the rancher's days began to take a new shape. The cabin no longer echoed with emptiness. Quilts lay rumpled from small bodies stirring at night. A shawl, patched and faded, hung near the door beside his coat. The table bore more than one bowl now, spoons resting side by side. He moved through chores the way he always had, splitting wood, tending the horses, hauling water. But there was a different weight to them. Each stroke of the axe, each bucket filled, was no longer just for himself. The woman kept to quiet work. She rose early, stoked the fire, set pots to boil with whatever she had, wild onions, root scraps, bits of dried meat he'd brought down from the ridge. She mended clothes with neat, strong stitches, humming low while her daughters played at her feet. Sometimes her eyes drifted to the window, where he would pass with an armload of wood or the slow stride of a man returning from the traps. She didn't call out. She didn't need to. The sight of him moving steady, day after day, was enough to steady her too. The girls grew stronger with each sunrise. Their cheeks plumped with color, their cries sharpened into healthy noise. They slept in a row of baskets lined with fur and hay, tiny hands curling around anything within reach. At night, their soft breathing filled the cabin, weaving into the crackle of the fire, making the place feel less like a shelter against cold and more like a hearth that held warmth of its own. Conversation stayed sparse. The rancher spoke few words, and the woman, though finding her voice again, let silence linger between them. It wasn't the silence of strangers anymore, but of two people learning a new rhythm. She placed an extra spoon in the pot without asking. He set aside the thickest cut of meat without mention. Their kindnesses met in the middle, unspoken but felt. On afternoons when the weather warmed, he worked outside with his sleeves rolled, shaping cedar into boards or mending tools worn thin. She sat nearby on the porch, nursing her daughters, her eyes following his hands as they moved with careful strength. Neither broke the quiet, yet something passed between them, a steadiness, a recognition that home could be built out of the simplest acts. By evening, when shadows stretched long across the yard, she would sing softly to the girls, old lullabies, words blurred by time, but gentle as falling rain. He would sit just inside the door, knife in hand, polishing the blade or mending tack, his head bent but his ears listening. The sound filled corners of the cabin that had gone empty for too many years. The new everyday life was not marked by grand gestures. It was marked by the steady layering of small things. Soup simmering on the fire, wood stacked high against the wall, 3 names carved and hung above the hearth. It was the way her eyes softened when she saw those names, and the way his chest eased when he caught her looking. In that slow weaving of days, loneliness loosened its grip. The cabin, once only 4 walls against the wind, began to feel like a place worth staying. Not perfect, just decent enough to hold them all. No vows, no rings, just the fire that found a place to live. Summer had come to the ridge, quiet as a prayer. The last of the snow had long melted into the creeks, leaving the grass tall and bending in the wind. The cabin, once a lonely outpost, now stood alive with small signs of change. Herbs drying by the window, a shawl flapping on the porch rail, children's laughter chasing across the yard like sparrows set free. The rancher sat on the steps one evening, boots dusted, hands resting on his knees. Beside him lay a basket of green beans he had pulled from the garden rows out back. The work had left dirt in the lines of his palms, but he didn't mind. He watched the sun ease down behind the peaks, sky spilling into gold and lavender, and let the silence sit warm around him. Through the window, he could see her moving about the kitchen, flour dusting her fingers as she kneaded dough. Her hair was tied back loose, wisps catching the light. Now and then she glanced outside, catching his outline against the dusk. She didn't smile much. Her life had taught her to hold emotions close. But when her eyes met his, something eased in her face, something softer than a smile, yet truer. The 3 girls tumbled in the yard, their dresses streaked with grass, their voices high and bright. They carried no memory of cold fences or cruel hands. Their world was now the porch steps, the fire inside, the broad figure of the man who never raised his voice, but was always there. They ran, fell, rose again, as children do, and the sound of it filled the space between the trees. When she finished with the bread, the woman stepped outside, wiping her hands on her apron. She carried 2 mugs, steam rising, and set one in his hand before sitting beside him. Their shoulders brushed. Neither spoke at first. They simply sat, watching the girls weave circles in the fading light. At last, she rested her hand lightly over his. His fingers curled slow beneath hers, not a grip, just a meeting. She turned to him then, her voice soft, almost lost to the wind. "This fire between us," she said, "it never went out." He looked ahead, eyes catching the last of the sun, the corners crinkling in a way that was almost a smile. His answer came low, steady, certain. It just needed a place to live. They let the silence take back the space between them, but it was no longer the silence of strangers. It was the quiet of belonging, of two people who had walked through storm and shame and found, against all odds, that they had chosen each other simply by staying. As the first stars showed, the girls collapsed in a heap of laughter, dresses wrinkled, hair wild with summer wind. Their mother rose to gather them inside, her touch gentle, her voice low as she guided them to bed. The rancher stayed on the porch, watching the dark settle, listening to the cabin breathe with new life. No one passing by would know the story, not the cold nights, the riders who came with claims, the old wounds carried beneath the skin. But they would see the glow of fire through the window, hear children laughing in their sleep, and know that something good had rooted here. Not perfect, just decent enough to stay. The night folded soft across the ridge, and the cabin stood steady beneath the stars. A place of quiet, of kindness, of a love that did not need words to be real. Out here, on the edge of the mountains, a cabin became more than timber and stone. It became proof that even in a land of hard winters and harder men, kindness can take root and make a home. No grand speeches, no promises written down. Just small acts, steady hands, and the choice to stay when walking away would have been easier. Maybe you've known that kind of silence. Maybe you've carried old wounds or wished for a place where someone would look at you and simply say, "You belong here." If so, I hope this story sat with you a while, like a quiet fire warming your hands. If it did, I'd be grateful to hear your thoughts. Share a memory, a feeling, or just a word that stayed with you. Sometimes the smallest voices, offered with honesty, are enough to remind us we're not alone on this trail.